Hey, this is Morten from FlippedNormals. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create a lush environment with scattered foliage like the one you're seeing on screen now, using the built-in particle system in Blender. I'll show you how to light effectively with an HDRI, how you can use existing assets to create more variation in your scatters, and also take you through how to create realistic shaders for your foliage, as well as setting up your final composition. This isn't really intended for beginners, and I'll be glancing over some basic concepts that I feel intermediate artists would be familiar with. But if you are new to particles, I suggest you check out the Emitter Particle course for Blender by Joakim Tornhill on FlippedNormals.com. It'll give you all the tools you need to truly understand how they work and how you can use them to your benefit. There's a link in the description below. Regardless of your level though, I still invite you to follow along with me, as I'll be covering a lot of different techniques that I think everyone will benefit from. But to kick things off, we're just going to have a quick look at some basic Blender settings. Generally, I keep Blender pretty vanilla, so everyone can follow along. But there are 3 quality of life improvements that I do want to point out that I'll be using throughout this tutorial. So if you go to your preferences, go to add-ons. The first one, if you just search for Pi, it's the interface viewport, 3D viewport Pi menus. The ones that I'm using, or the one that is specific to this tutorial, is going to be the origin Pi menu, which is mapped to Control-Alt-X. It just allows you a quick set of shortcuts for where you want to place your origin point. You can go through these and enable and disable whichever ones you like. Next up is going to be one that probably most people have already enabled. It's the Node Wrangler. Node Wrangler just makes working with shaders infinitely easier, so I would definitely encourage you to do that. And the last little thing is, I'm not going to show that per se, but in the hotkeys, I've enabled, or I've remapped local view to Alt Q. You could just search for local view, and then you can remap that if you want to as well. It's just a little easier for my fingers, I feel like, to hit Alt and Q. So to start off with, we are going to create a cylinder. So something to keep in mind is that we're going to be scattering things, maybe in the thousands or tens of thousands. So you want to think about optimizing geometry already from the beginning. Having a cylinder with 32 sides is just excessive, especially for what we're doing. It might be applicable for what you're doing, but for this one, we're just going to go with 8. And then we'll scale it. See. You're going to want to create something that it's like branch shape. We're going after a bush kind of shape, and so we want something that's thin but not too thin and tall at the same time. So a small little tip here: if you press scale, S for scale, and then Shift and Z, you're going to restrict the scaling to only happen on the X and Y axis. It's just a little faster instead of scaling up and scaling down all the time. So probably something like that. And what I've also done is I've just put it a little bit through the ground. That's going to help us once we start scattering. That way we're not scattering this part of the bush right on top of the ground. It's going to be scattered just below. That helps with orientation, rotation, and if your terrain has like funky normals or more extreme normals, this can help that. For all of this, it's going to be like a freestyled approach, so there's no set values as such that you have to input. It really depends on your scene scale and the complexity of your object. But for this, I am gonna go into edit mode, Control R, and just give ourselves some spans, maybe something like that. And then enable the fall off. You can do the proportional editing with O. And then we're just gonna, make this branch, or this is like the stem of the bush. And we're just gonna make it a little bit crooked, so it's a little bit organic at least. Maybe something like that. Then we're going to duplicate it, move it over to the side. This is going to be our branch that we're going to sort of attach to the stem here. one difference between these two is that I'm going to take the top part and hit M, and I'm going to center or merge it in the center, and just scale this down a little bit so it tapers up towards the top. I'm going to leave the branch one open, and that has to do with the scattering, like how we want leaves and flowers and so on to scatter on the branch over here. You can leave them both open or leave them both closed. It's really up to you. I think the result just is better this way. And we'll take this one, scale it down a little bit, maybe like that. And when you see me snapping to the viewport like this, I'm just holding down Alt and then middle mouse dragging to the viewport. And I'm going to come in and switch to face mode, just hit the 3 key, and I'm going to delete these faces right here. There we go. And so now it just keeps it open. That just means that we're not going to have anything spawning on the tips of these, because it can look a little bit funky. Now something that's kind of key when you're working with particle systems is that's going to be your items transforms. So you can see I've moved this over to the side, that's fine. But the scale is sort of all off now, right? Because we've scaled it. The same thing goes for this. Things behave weirdly when the transforms aren't like neat, specifically the scale, and also sometimes the rotation. So what we're gonna do for both of these is hit Control A, and you have a bunch of different options. We are gonna select, we can just do all transforms. If you do all transforms like this and the top one, it sort of just moves your origin down to the center of the world. You can also choose to reset it where it is. Like if you select this and hit Control A, say all transforms to deltas, everything's zeroed out, but it leaves the origin point. I wouldn't recommend this in this case. It really varies from the task that you have, but location data, like whether something is moved to the right, left, up, or down, doesn't really affect us. So let's undo that again, hit Control A, and we'll just say just the scale, and we'll manually manipulate this origin point here. So hit Control period, and move this down. Do that by hitting G, and then again middle mouse to lock it, and we'll just sort of move it into place, something like that. And again, the same thing with this one. We're keeping it under the center line. That just means it's going to be born or spawned inside the surface of the branch and not necessarily like floating off of it somewhere. So now that we have our branch, let's just Control period to remove that again. Now that we have our branch and our stem, let's do this properly. Let's call this stem and branch. There we go. Something that's really key for working with particles, or at least makes it more flexible and allows you to do more advanced things, are vertex groups. Essentially, the vertex groups will be deciding where branches are spawned, where leaves go, and the same thing with the flowers. So if we start out with our stem, go to vertex groups, we're going to create 2 vertex groups. One is going to be for the density, and the other one it's going to be for the length. Length is going to be for the length of the branches, and density is going to be for where those branches spawn. So with our vertex group selected, go into edit mode, and yeah, you just select all the vertices from where you want it to spawn. Hit Shift C to go into sort of X-ray mode so you can select all the way through, and hit assign, and the same thing with the length. Now for these two, we're going to be editing them in a little bit with our weight paint tool, but for now we just want to assign them to everything. With our branch, we're also going to need 2 groups. This one is going to be one for the leaves and one for the flower, and you can mix this up however you want and experiment with density and clumping and so forth. You can make this like really advanced. So jump into edit mode. You can see here, just create 2 vertex groups. It doesn't matter if you create the vertex groups outside or inside of edit mode, but you have to select the vertices or faces inside of edit mode. We'll do leaves, and flowers. So for the flowers, again, Shift C to view all the way through, assign there. And for the leaves, we're going to select this and say assign. We don't want leaves all the way in here. And again, we can tweak this after the fact as well. Now to the fun part, the particles. So we're going to select our stem, go to particles, create a particle system, and we're going to switch it to hair. This just allows us to spawn particles that don't necessarily, move. If you choose emitter, the base sort of behavior for that is to go everywhere. It's going to do stuff. You can use that to create fire and things like that. Hair gives us more control for what we want to do. The settings for our particle systems are going to be fairly basic because they're just branches. The first thing we want to do is decrease the number. I don't know, 10, 20, 30, something like that. Yeah, it seems pretty good. You can always experiment with this and see what's a good number for you. The other thing is going to be render. If you go to render, switch it from render as path to object. Scroll down to our object and we're going to select our branch. Next up, in order to give ourselves some more control, is we're going to enable advanced and rotation. Because particles tend to spawn weirdly sometimes, we want more control. We want control over the look of our final bush. So under rotation, change the orientation axis. And what we're going to do is we're going to spawn them sort of upwards and then force them down. So we change this to object Y. You might need to experiment with this depending on how you created your branch. So let's see if I rotate this now. If it's locked, like if you've gone in and you've edited this and you've rotated it around, you can see it sort of moves. So again, that's why the transforms are pretty important. There's some bugs in Blender when it comes to rotation as well that we're going to take a look at later, but I'll show you how to combat a lot of this. And you can basically, make Blender do whatever you want. Then we are going to randomize it a little bit. You can see this sort of pulls the branches down, and we're also going to randomize the phase. So randomize phase just makes it completely random. And for when you're spawning things on the ground, you might want to pull this up to 2. But for this, we just want a little extra variation in all of this. And then we are going to come down to scale. And we're going to scale these up. We're going to scale up the scale randomness a little bit. And we might want to randomize it a little more. See the phase. You can always look at it from the top to see. We don't want it like that because it's too much in one direction. So maybe like that. And outwards like this. Maybe a little bit bigger. That's good bush material. And now you can see that the way that it penetrates through the bush might be a little too much. So we can come back to our branch, go into edit mode, select all of it by hitting A, hit G, it's fall off, hit G, Z, and then move it up a little bit. You can see we can sort of tweak where it's going to intersect with the bush, right? So maybe something like that. It's a good middle ground. All of this is going to be covered in leaves anyway, so you're not really going to see this. But you could tweak this to your heart's content until it's like perfect. And you can go in afterwards as well, tweak it to make sure that it's what you want. Something like that. So this is where our vertex groups become important, because then we can actually start to manipulate the way that everything is spawned on our object. So if you scroll down, come down to vertex groups, click this little button, select density, and select length for length. Now, these are just called what they're called because we named them that. You could call these A and B. It doesn't really matter. The naming is irrelevant. Select your object again, go to vertex group, and then we're going to switch to weight mode. Okay, so red is fully covered, and the color blue means nothing is covered. So if we select density, for example, I don't want anything to spawn down here. Easiest way to get rid of that is select the gradient tool, put the weight all the way down to 0, and then just start dragging. And then you can see you can decide from which point you want things to spawn, right? You can also spawn all the way down here. That's also a great way to make a bush for something like a tumbleweed or something, I guess. But we'll do something like that. And then we'll come to length and put that to 0. Yeah. And then we can see, we can sort of drag down and it'll be interactive. So we'll, whoops. Yeah, if you undo, it sort of jumps back. So just keep that in mind. Maybe that's good. You know, we want it to be longer at the bottom, shorter at the top. It hasn't had as much time at the top to grow, you know. Okay, go back to object mode. Then you can go into your particles again and just see. So now, because now the look has changed a little bit. Like that. You know, if you don't like it, you can change the seed. Completely throws you off, gives you different looks, and you can do this to generate more variations of different bushes. So that looks pretty nice. I think we're going to go with that. Something that you might want to do so you can keep track of everything is name your particle system. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to name this branch. Yeah, I'm just going to name it branch. And so this is like the global particle name, which will show up when you apply particle systems to other things. And we'll name it the same thing up here. This is like a local view. So if you add branches again to another piece of geo, this up here will say particle system, but here it'll say branch. And while particles are great, you also need actual geometry at some point. And we're going to do that with where the bush is now. So we can sort of take a snapshot of that, and that's what that's going to be our base bush. So I'm just going to, for ease of use, I'm just going to name this branch P and stem P for particles, just so that I know. I'm going to take my stem P and I'm going to shift D to duplicate it so I have a backup of it. So this one is going to be our original. We're going to hide that, and we'll take this and now we'll merge everything into one. So we'll go to modifiers and say make instances real. And you can see that it's taken all of our branches, the 21 branches that we created, and it's made them into geo. Now what it doesn't do, it doesn't take the parent or what you're emitting on. It doesn't do anything with that because that's already geometry. Just so you know. So we'll merge all those things into one. So if you come down here, you can see our stem is still here. And if I move it around, that also has particles on it, right? So go into your particle system for that one and just delete it. So that way we have our stem and we have our geometry branches. Now we want to merge all of these together. So they're one object essentially. So let's just select them all good. Now, what can happen when you do this, let me show you, is let's take the stem here. This is our particle stem. And we'll select this again and hit Control and J. Now what can happen here, depending on how you've created your particle system, these particles can then start to spawn in other places. This is because these branches here are what they're instances. So they're not technically individual pieces of geometry yet. They're all instances of this branch. So if you come to this branch, you can see under its object properties that this says 22 because there's 21 of it here and there's another one here. This is going to be more of a problem when we move forward, but it's good to know. This example over here is kind of irrelevant actually, because it doesn't spawn on there. So let's just hide that. So select the particle branch, make things unique. Now I'm gonna, if you were to just try to merge things now, this is technically the last active selected one. So it's not gonna, it's not gonna merge. So I'll select the stem here, select them all, Control J, and now they're all merged into one. And I'll call this stem geo. Now we know this is our geometry base that we can then spawn leaves on. And again, it's important to remember, like if you move this around and scale it or anything, you want to hit Control A and apply those transforms and make sure that it's centered here in the world for now, and that our origin is like here, and it sticks through the floor a little bit. Now onto the leaf. So for all these things, so now we have our branch, and we can take this. And we'll just move this to the side as well. And we're going to start creating a leaf. And it's just going to be really simple. We don't want anything fancy. Because again, we want to like mass spawn this across like vast distances, right? For this example, I'm probably just going to do a few hundred. But you could do scenes with, you know, thousands of them, hundreds of thousands. And so you want to, again, think about performance. So I'm going to select a plane and make a general leaf shape. Again, we're just sort of going to restyle this a little bit. So Control R to insert a little loop. And you could find some references of leaves. Probably be good. I have some references up on my other monitor. That way, I'm just making sure that I make something that's, you know, vaguely leaf shaped. But it could be anything, you know, it doesn't have to be a leaf. You could make a bush with, I don't know, frogs or something, and then spawn those. The possibilities are pretty much endless with this type of system. A quick little tip here is if you hold down Alt, select these, it selects a loop, Shift Alt, and like selects multiple loops, just makes it a little bit faster. So that's a general leaf shape, but it does. We can add a little more detail to it. I don't think it's gonna. That's not what's gonna break us. What you can do here as well is if you select 3 vertices or more, you can select many. Select the first one and then the last one here. Hit M, and then merge at last. Just merges there, makes it just a little bit quicker. And let's just do a little bit more detail. One thing you can do here, if you want to make a corner a little tighter, you can hit G twice, and that way it sort of slides on the edge here. So we can bring these two a little closer together, and then I might want to enable proportional editing. That way I can make things fall off a little bit more smoothly. And I'm doing this on purpose. A little bit rough, you know, just I still want it to be somewhat organic. It doesn't need to be perfect because nothing in nature is perfect. So it can be a little bit wonky. That's completely fine. And while you're moving things around with proportional editing, you know, you can scroll up and down on your scroll wheel. There we go. We've got something that resembles a leaf, a vague leaf shape. You know, and you can do basically anything you want here. And I keep mentioning it because it's important, but the origin point is key. If you were to take this leaf and spawn that here, for example, now it would spawn like the center. And that's not where leaves grow from. You know, leaves grow from the base. I realized that there's no like base tip. I don't know, the stem of the leaf isn't there, but it's going to be covered. So I think that's unnecessary detail. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You could either, the easy way is just to go into edit mode, select everything and move it forward. That's, you know, that's fine because the origin point stays the same. But let's say you've actually moved it. And you moved it over here again, and put a little bit behind the center line is always good, so it spawns in another object. So now the line is moved, or the origin point has moved with it. We don't want that. Let's see, we'll just move it up a little bit as well. So think about it, this is where it'll spawn from. So a couple different ways. You could hit Control period, move it into position, or again you could hit Control A and say, for this, in this case, you would use location, just apply that because it applies it at the base. That way that is sort of fixed. And another thing, again, importantly, is scale. We're going to be creating a procedural material for this. So if your scale isn't 111, it's gonna distort the procedural shaders. So again, Control A, you could just say all transforms because there's nothing else on here, or just scale, for example. So it's probably good to just take our stem here again and move it back to 0. Take a leaf, put it out here. The way I'm thinking about it is that our main object will stay in the center. I should have just hidden it before. There's no reason to move it, just to make it easier so I could see the leaf. But our main object will stay in the center for now, and all of our spawn objects will go to the side. That's a good way to think about it. So as with everything else, we're going to name this appropriately. So we're going to do leaf P because this is going to be our particle leaf. Now let's move on to spawning particles on our branches. The really cool thing about the vertex groups that we created before is that, we created leaves and flower vertex groups on the branch, which then, is merged into what we're doing now. So if we select this and we say flowers, go in and say select, it's just going to be selecting the tips of these branches, and that's where the flowers are going to spawn. So it makes it, really, really clean and really easy to do instead of having to go in after the fact and select these. So just as before, we select our base object and go to particles, create a particle system, select hair, because we want the same thing. And we're going to need a low number to start with. I don't really know. Let's just do 100 so we don't overwhelm the system. Go to path, select object, select our object. We can just about see the leaf, and it's going to spawn the leaf on the branches. Now there's going to be a lot of tweaking and getting it to look just right for what you're trying to do. I can't say anything is right or anything is wrong. It really just depends on the look that you're after. The first thing you want to do after you've spawned it, as you can see, raining leaves everywhere. If we go down to density and we're going to select leaves, should have called it leaves density or whatever. But yeah, now it's just going to be spawning leaves where we want them. Go in again, select leaves and say select. You can see it just spawns them on the branches and not here at the base of the branch. And as before, with our bush, we are going to turn on advanced and enable rotation. And again, rotation is going to depend on where, so this right now, it's created this way, right? Facing towards X. But the rotation is it's set to 0. This is one of the things where if you create it the other way, you will have to experiment. And so if yours doesn't look exactly like this, once you enable rotation, don't worry, you can always toggle through these. So I'm going to go with object Y. That way we sort of spawn them outwards, kind of like, this is how I imagine leaves, or how leaves would spawn. It's sort of horizontal almost. And we're just going to set the random up quite a lot because we don't want it to be perfectly horizontal. And we're going to set the random phase to 2. So now it becomes completely random like that. One thing you can do is you can enable use object rotation. That way you can get a more full distribution. And then afterwards you can come in and you can say rotate on Y, and you can tweak it from here. So maybe you could use this to simulate some wind or something, put a noise thing on this, and then just subtly rotate this. That way it would animate on your bush as well. So just keep all these things in mind. There's a lot of different ways you can experiment with this and I guess make it your own. Next thing is going to be our scale. So we want to scale these up quite a lot. I want this to be like a small bush, so the leaves have to feel, I guess, pretty big. But I also want more leaves. So let's see, scale randomness. I don't know. Scale randomness is good because it gives us that perception of something is real. I don't know. Let's do 500. So, like, distribution looks good, or like density looks good, but it's really hard to judge when, when you're just looking in the viewport like this. And the best way around this is to set up a quick lighting setup. And the way we're going to do that is with an HDRI. I've provided an HDRI if you go to the link in the description, you can head over to FlippedNormals.com and download a free project file, and the HDRI is going to be in there. But you can also just head to Polyhaven where I got this, download a bunch of their free HDRIs and experiment with it there. So what I usually like to do is split my workspace like this once I get into lighting and rendering. The bottom one here, we're going to select shader editor. Select world, then hit Shift A, search for environment texture. And what you could do is to make it easier for yourself, you could drag in the texture. This is going to be wrong because it's just an image texture. Delete it again and then select that one from the already imported files, or just use the Blender Finder. To begin with, we're going to keep it really simple and just hook this up right away. A little bit later, I'll show you how to control all of this independently. And for me, I'm going to switch to cycles instead of Eevee. I'll be using my GPU with denoising because I feel like it gives me a better preview and it's really quick. Obviously, if you don't have a powerful GPU, this probably won't work for you. I'm using an RTX Titan, so the denoising I found is really, really good. Let's see if I disable denoising, there's a lot of noise that it needs to go through first in order for me to preview it. If I just enable denoising, it's pretty much instant. Now let's move on to creating the actual leaf material. So let's select our leaf particle here. That's our base. Create a new material. Just going to use the standard Principled BSDF shader. And what we want to do is Shift A, search for a noise texture. That's going to be what creates the base of our noise, or base of our texture, I guess. Plug that into a color ramp to give us a little more control. Color into the fact, color into color. And that gives us some rudimentary noise. Like I mentioned before, if your scale transform is off, your noise is going to look different as well. So just keep that in mind. So first off, what I want to do is create a little bit more contrast in the leaf. So I'm just going to crunch these together. You can do, whatever you want. Create some cool effects. Just a little bit more contrast. Pull down the scale somewhat. Detail, we want to make it just a little bit softer. Not have as much detail in there. Roughness, probably fine. Just a little bit of distortion, tiny amount. So there you go. Looks pretty good. And you can experiment with all of these values yourself. If roughness just creates a rougher look, more detail. Detail creates more detail. Distortion creates more detail in the distortion. So basically higher numbers, more detail for everything. But obviously this doesn't look very leaf-like, right? We need actual color. So Shift A, search for a mix RGB, plug it in here, and we want to use the color in the FAC. And then that way, whatever we have in here is going to be split between these two colors. So we'll go for something green, yellowish, like that. You can hit Control C and Control V and just paste the two values in here. And I'll make this one slightly darker. And that's our sort of base leaf, right? It doesn't look very leaf-like because there's no translucency. Might also want to just increase the roughness a little bit. You have really shiny leaves, but that's not what I'm after. Now where the magic happens with this shader is the translucence shader. So Shift A, search for translucent BSDF, and we're going to need a add shader. That way we're going to be adding the translucent part to our principal BSDF. So add these two together, take our color into the translucent color and the shader into the surface. And there we go. Now all of a sudden you can see we have the sun shining through our leaves. If you just plug this back in, you can see that's what it was before, and that's what it is for free, basically, with some shader magic. And one thing you can do to spice up your leaves a little bit more, you know, because right now it's basic and it's efficient, but that's to go into the leaf and add a couple of modifiers. Keep in mind, it's going to impact performance, so you can always turn it off if you don't want to. The first one is going to be the solidify. So solidify just adds a little bit of thickness to our leaf. And you can see instantly by doing that, we lose a lot of the light that was shining through. But it is also very thin. I might double that. So it's a good thickness. The next thing you could do is if you just hit Control 1, it adds a subdivision surface modifier and just makes it smooth. Now, what I like to do with this one, I'll leave the solidify modifier on, but I'll actually take the levels in the viewport down to 0, just because of viewport performance, especially when you scatter more bushes. One thing to keep in mind, it's not happening for me at the moment, but you might have weird translucency issues when you're using this shader. And if your leaf you've gone into shade smooth, sometimes the angles can make it so the translucency is kind of weird. So I tend to keep to shade flat whenever I'm working with this, just to avoid any kind of weird flickering or anything. But you know, experiment with it, see if it works. And if it does, don't worry about it. I might hit the render down to 1. There we go. So in order to create a little bit more oomph, some more believability, let's say, you can tweak the translucency and the base shader independently. So I'm going to go and find a hue and saturation, plug it in there, Shift D, and plug it in there. So we'll have one where we can control the value and the color separately for the two, right? So for the top one, I don't know, maybe you want to yellow. Yeah, see, if you pull this down, we'll make it a little bit more yellow. And I'm going to take the value and crank it up. So that way we let more light through, essentially. Maybe 1.8 seems to do the trick. There we go. And then what you can do the same thing for the bottom shader. You can take the value down to maybe make it a little bit darker, because maybe it was too light. And then when we look through it, you know, it has a nice natural look to it. And you can always, you know, exaggerate this if you really wanted to, all the way down. So just to have an extra degree of freedom when editing your shader. And to make this, I guess, pop a little bit more, let's actually turn up this subdivision in the viewport just so we can preview it, is going to be a little bit of bump. So Shift A, search for bump. And we're going to use the same noise as we are for our color ramp. What you can do is hit Shift and right mouse button to drag over, and you'll add a little connection point. This can make it a little more clean when you have more complex shader groups. So we'll plug that into the height, and we'll plug the normal into the normal. And that way we have some bump added to our leaves. Just gives us a little more, you know, more surface to reflect off of. But this looks a little bit weird. We'll tweak it. Select the noise texture, hit Control T, again using the Node Wrangler add-on, but most of you probably know this. And we're going to change this from generated to object. And that way, if we change it to object, generated is like size dependent, scale dependent, object is independent. So it doesn't matter the size of your object, it only matters what your mapping nodes says. And so we can tweak it like that. Another thing you can do to make it a little bit nicer, you know, if you really wanted to organize this, is you can select any node and hit Control H, and that way it only displays the active inputs on those nodes. Do the same thing over here, and then you can, you know, clean it up nice and neatly the way you want it organized. So the final thing here is I'm probably gonna just turn down this just a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. Something like that. So I want it to be subtle, just a little bit more. I want it to be subtle, like it shouldn't grab your focus and make you think, hey, that's a weird looking leaf. Again, we're not going to be looking at the leaves like this. If we were, we might be using a texture instead. But I'm, you know, from this kind of distance. So keep that in mind, that also plays a part. Now that we have our base leaf and base bush, we're going to move on to our flower. And let's just enable some viewport stuff here so we can see some color. Duplicate our leaf, move it to the side, and I'm going to call this flower P. So the flowers are going to be created from the leaves, just makes it a lot more simple. The way I'm going to do that is I'll duplicate this a couple times and I'll just sort of rotate them out like this. And then I'll move it up. Maybe I should have done this before I rotated it. Something like this. Again, intersections here don't really matter because you're not going to see it. But you could, you know, tweak it a little bit if you wanted to. I say they don't matter, but then I go in and I actually edit it anyway. Okay, so we'll select these three, duplicate them, move them up, scale them down, and let's rotate them like this. So when I'm locked to a viewport, like hold down Alt and middle mouse button and dragging around, it's sort of locked to that axis, right? It makes it a lot easier. I don't have to press R and then Z in order to lock it. That's usually just how I work. So we'll take these three, move them up a little bit, and then maybe move them up. And here you can hit double R to rotate them along the viewing axis. Might actually just pull them down again. That's our flower. All right, select them all, hit Control J. Now they're all merged. And again, this origin point is important. So now that we've moved it off to the side, right? It's going to stay here. It has rotation values and scale values that we don't want. We can keep the location value though. That's fine. So what we'll do is hit Control A and say apply rotation and apply scale. The reason we're not applying the location is because we did that. It moves the origin point all the way over here, which is not going to perform correctly. Go back to the flower, hit Control period, G, middle mouse button and then drag it just something like that below the surface. And we'll just see, yeah, it's somewhat in the middle, right? Not entirely. And we'll just hit Control period again, and then we'll move it back on the center line. So here it can be on the center line, that's fine. Like again, this doesn't matter where it is in world space. It's like its own local space and where the origin point sits in relation to the geometry. That's important. In order to create the flower material, we're going to keep it real simple. We're just going to take this one material, which we're going to call leaf. So that's the leaf material. And we're going to make this material on the flower unique and call it flower. We'll take these, move them back. We'll do the same trick, shift, right mouse button and drag to make one solid connection there. Duplicate the hue and saturation, put it before. And we might just want to set this to default. And then we'll create like a reddish kind of flower. Maybe we'll have more saturation actually. Like that. I think that looks pretty good. Cool. And because they're all merged from the same kind of object with the same modifiers, it gets to keep the exact same thing. And you know, we can preview that in our viewport if we want. We get that nice scattering. What we might want to do here actually is we might want more. I think we want more. Yeah, cool. Now we can scatter our leaves, or sorry, our flowers onto the tips of our bush here. The nice thing is we've already done all of the work, you know, we're reusing the shader and now we'll be reusing the particle system as well. So go to our bush. Let's just see here. Oh, make sure to name this properly. Go to our bush, go to our particles, and here we're going to name these leaves. Do the same thing in the local one, leaves, and select it, hit the little arrow, say duplicate. And now you see it says the same thing. We'll make it unique. We'll call this flowers and call that one flowers. Now right now it's just spawned the same thing with the exact same position and everything on top. We don't want that. I'll just decrease this number real quick to 100. And instead of using the leaf P, we're just going to select this and select the flower. Cool. Obviously now it gets spawned everywhere. Let's decrease it even more. 50 maybe. Let's start with that. We can always tweak it. And importantly, we want to use our vertex groups. So the density, instead of selecting leaves, we're going to select flowers. That way, the flowers are only getting spawned out here at the, not exactly the tips, but like the end of it, right? Because by default, if you go into source, it emits from the face or the faces. So any face that's connected to these 8 vertices up here, which is like down to the first span, that's where it's gonna spawn from. But re-enable those again, and then we should probably decrease the size of this. Like, we don't want these to grab too much attention. They should be relatively inconspicuous. They should add like just a little bit of like an accent to the bush, but nothing more. You can go and I can see like the leaves here, they're obscuring the flowers a little bit. So might want to play around with this a little bit. Go back to our flowers. Make them just a little, like a tad bigger. So there we go. So now we've got that red accent on the bush, but it doesn't, you know, it's not the most important element of the bush. And one thing that's important to note here is remember to save. You never know when Blender might crash, especially when working with particles. It's super important, actually. One final tweak I just want to do is actually, I was just looking at this and I want to add more leaves to this. So we'll just be 600. Maybe 700. That's probably good. Yeah, something like this. I wanted a more full bush. You know, I wanted the coverage to be bigger. So I felt like it was a little bit too scarce. So that, you know, that concludes our bush. And we'll take this. I'll actually rename this to bush underscore P. And we'll do what we did before. Selected, dupe it, hide the original. Now we have our bush underscore geo. Go to modifiers and you can see we have 2 particle systems here. If you make the instance real of one of these, it'll do it for both. So include every particle system that's under this, both the flowers and the leaves. So make instances real. Now we have our flowers, 50 of those, and what was it, 700 leaves. So to make things easier in the beginning, at least when you're doing this, you might want to tweak some things. It's good while everything is selected, hit M and add it all to a new collection. I'll just foliage. This is just a temporary collection, by the way. So I'm going to select that and I'll hide it. You can see nothing happened because, again, this bush geo has particle systems on it. So we'll remove those and that'll keep our base here, right? One thing that's good to do while we're here is make the quickest bush shader in the world. We'll make it somewhat brownish, maybe desaturate it a little bit, more yellow. You might want to take the roughness up so it's not as shiny. Cool. So now we have our foliage and we have this. And remember the issue I spoke about before, where you have systems like this, where if you go to the object properties, you can see there's 700 instances of this leaf and 50 or 51, 701 instances of these 2 things, right? I'm going to save and we'll unhide all of this. What we can do is just right click here and say select objects, and you can merge them, Control J, and you can see now, because they're instances, they're going to sort of spawn from that one. It's a whole mess. Again, go to our base objects here, go to object properties, make it unique, and make it unique. So now select objects and merge them. Nothing happens, right? You can see they're merged and we're all good. One thing that did change though is the scale, rotation, and location. So you got to keep that in mind. Always be wary of the transforms when you're working with procedural things or particles. It's always important to keep in mind. And you can see it. Like when I merge it, here it's much more broad and diffuse. Once I merge it, it becomes a lot more clear, a lot more crisp. I think it's too much. It kind of looks like paper mache now. But we'll fix this. It's really easy to do. One thing that is good to consider what you want to do, like I want to merge all of this into one, right? And my leaves and flowers have a solidify and a sub-D modifier on it. You may or may not want that on your branch. For me, it doesn't really matter that much, so I'll go ahead and do it. To make things a little bit easier when you're doing this, the merging, is remembering that the last thing that you select, that's what everything's going to be merged into, if that makes sense. So you can see our bush is now the active tool here. I select this, and then I select this as the active tool, and I merge it. You can see we actually got back our scale because the stem has everything zeroed out. But in case that, you know, that's not what you have, let's do it wrong on purpose. We'll merge it like this. So we merged it with the leaves, and you can see everything is busted. So you want to select it and hit Control A, and you can just say all transforms for this. It's going to put it down here at the center. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is, again, depending on the order that you merge things in, you may or may not keep your modifiers. Because we selected the leaves at the end, we kept them. And we're looking at this and it's looking good. We can see the subdivision for this. It's gonna take a while because there's a lot of leaves now. We have 700 leaves plus the 50 flowers. This is what it looks like, right? So it's a lot softer now, and I guess looks more organic. It's looking good from the back. But this is what we end up with here, right? Sort of poking through the ground. And again, this is why it's nice to pull it down a little bit, but to fix it, to make it, I guess, more accurate, we can select it, just select that bottom face and delete it. There we go. And you can see it also became solid. Not that it really matters, it doesn't really add any more detail to this object. And the last thing we want to do is we'll select this again and rename this bush geo again. I'll move it into the collection and delete that temp collection there. So now this is what we're going to be scattering across the plane, across our landscape. So just move this over. We don't need it now. We'll actually just move all of these over quite far. Again, just hit N to make sure that your transforms are correct. No rotation, no scale. We're going to create a plane. Everything will be spawned on this plane. So, I don't know, something like this, maybe. There we go. And go into edit mode, select the faces, right click, subdivide, hit Shift R. So repeat that subdivision just a couple of times because we need this to have some base resolution. And select proportional editing. And you know, now I want to edit this plane just to give it some variation. We'll do some other stuff with displacement maps, but this is just like an initial one just to help ourselves out, so we know what's our base plane at least going to look like. That's a nice looking plane, I guess. Maybe just pull down there at the sides. So now we have our base plane. Go to modifiers, select displace, and select new, go to our texture, select the texture, go clouds. Again, you can do whatever you want here to make yours look nice. I think clouds tend to work for a lot of things. I'm just kind of completely winging it now with these values just to get some variation in the landscape here. Just seeing what looks nice, again, because everything depends on the scale you're working at. To make it a little more clear, I'll give it a quick shader, and we'll be editing this as well, so don't worry, it's just a very temporary shader so I can see what I'm doing. The roughness all the way up. Right click, shade smooth. And so now we have something basic, right? So we'll go to this modifier again, and add a subdivision modifier, maybe level 2 on the viewport. And so that's actually a good thing, just a quick note. Whatever you're doing with your subdivision modifiers, we're going to be scattering our bush on this, right? It might vary the look of stuff depending on how many subdivisions you have, because technically you're creating new geometry from which things spawn on. We'll take a look at how to circumvent that in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. We are going to use another displacement modifier. We'll just duplicate this first one, move it under this, the subdivision modifier. And again, important to make this unique, otherwise we're editing both of them. So we'll make this unique. And this one I want to have more fine detail, like more granular detail. So I'll go in here and scale it down, maybe like that. And go back, less intensity. And I'm just gonna add another subdivision surface modifier. There we go. Just to get rid of those super harsh shadows because they don't don't look good. So now we have undulating ground. It doesn't really match our plate, but it's kind of irrelevant, I think. So there we go. So now we have something that has some variation to it, so we can spawn things on there. Just to make everything nice and tidy, we'll rename this ground, and I can see it's been moved out of our collection. Now the fun begins. Again, I feel like I keep saying that. I think it's all fun, but this is where, you know, things are starting to come together. So select our plane, select our particles, create a particle system, and that's the bush we want to scatter, right? So as before, select hair. We'll just decrease this to like 100. Select path, object. You already know this, and select our bush. Now it's going to look weird right now, because the bush is scattered along the plane. Like, it doesn't perform the way you would think it does. We need to use a kind of hack to make this work in Blender. I don't know why, that's just how the particle system seems to work. What we can do is select advanced rotation, and we'll enable object rotation. The advanced rotation thing is not necessary, by the way, for this to work, but we will need it as well. So object rotation is the thing that we need. It's going to look at the orientation of this and apply it to our plane. So Y, and you know, the axis Y is what you want to tweak here. So we'll tweak this to be 90 degrees. 90 degrees. And you don't want to freeze it or apply transforms or anything. You want to have the 90 degrees on your plane for this to work. Don't ask me why. I've tried to find a solution. I can't. This is the best I've been able to come up with. But, you know, we can work around it. In order to make something that looks more organic, you can see everything is sort of rotated the same way if we look at it from the z-axis. Let's come down here and we'll set the orientation to normal. So now it sort of goes up from the normal. And then we'll just add a little bit of, if you rotate this too much, it's going to go back into the plane. We don't want that. We just want a little bit of rotation. It's like axial rotation. Not too much though, just a little bit. And then you want to go to random phase and set that to 2. That way they're sort of getting spun randomly all the way around, and it sort of creates this true random orientation for them, but while keeping their axis upwards. Now, this is where what I mentioned before can be important. If you're using subdivision in your viewport, that is different from the subdivision you're using when you're rendering. So here, if you look at my subdivisions, we're going to set this to 2. You can see once I do this, they change a little bit because now the normal changes, right? If you go to your particle system, under source, you can say use modifier stack. That way it'll evaluate the way the modifiers are in the correct order. And that way you can optimize your viewport experience a little bit more if you don't want like the full plane subdivided while you're working. Now we're working with such a small plane and there's not a lot of detail, so it doesn't make that big of a difference for us. And before we, make the terrain really nice and the bushes scattered just the way we want it, I'm going to go ahead and just create a basic material for the ground. And we'll just do what we did before. Noise texture, Shift A, and a color ramp. There we go. Let's plug these in, plug that in, and select the noise texture, hit Control T for our mapping and texture coordinate node. Use object as before, so it's like size independent. That way you can always work with the same values. Now, actually, just gonna Control C that, Control V it there. That way we have some values that we can work with. Okay. So now we have something, Let's paste that there. I want to do I'm not gonna make like the same deserty ground that's all the way around. It's gonna be a little bit different, but not like super colorful either. And we might want to increase our detail level and our roughness and distortion a little bit. Let's see. I don't know, not that much. Just a little bit. Okay, maybe add another one here. That way we have some separation. Okay, maybe something like that. Kind of ground we want. So now that we have like a basic thing here with all that on, we're going to start looking at what can we do to spice this up. Okay, let's have a look at just finalizing these bushes and just making it look a little bit nicer. Try to double the amount here. And let's have a look. You can really play around with this in any way you like, I guess. And I'm going to make some scale randomness. Scale randomness has a tendency to make everything look smaller because scaling some of it down. And so you can always compensate by scaling this up a little bit. Something like that, probably. Might be too many, but we'll find out. And from here on, it's really going to be quick because now we truly, I know I keep saying that, but now we truly have everything. What we want to do is we want to scatter some dead bushes around. So we'll take this, actually we won't take that. We're going to take our bush, nope, we're going to take our stem, the stem P here, right? Pull it out there, hide the stem P again, and obviously this one has our particle systems in it again. So we'll make the instances real, select our base, go to the object and make it unique. And go to particles here, remove them, select them all, and hit Control J. Again, this was the last selected one, so this is where it's going to be active. So we can take that. Let's take the bush geo. Just move it over there. Give it a shader, and I believe that was the one. I haven't been very diligent with adding my shaders, naming my shaders. So, but now we have this, right? So that's our, that actually looks pretty nice. Well, we're gonna use the ground shader for the bush, it seems. And we'll do the same thing as we did with this. We'll rotate it by 90 degrees because we're sort of emulating what we just did there. Select our plane, go to particles. We'll name this bush scatter. And name that bush scatter. This is the one that's going to have everything on it. So it's really important that you name these particle systems, I think. Select it, drop down, duplicate system, select your system, make unique. And we'll call this branch scatter. Do the same there. And we're going to select, delete that object and select our bush. Or our stem, I guess. So now it's using the exact same thing as before, so you won't see it, and then we can just differentiate our seed, and that gives us a lot more detail already, but maybe too many dead bushes. So maybe something like that. So it's kind of using the same system, you know. I might want to scale these down. Maybe make them even more random and scale them down a little bit. Kind of thinking that the dead ones might have been eroded a little more by wind or something, so you probably wouldn't see them as much. That's my logic, at least. Let's just remember to name this. We'll call this branch. We'll call it bush dead underscore geo. And now you could, you could stop here and you would have something that looks pretty decent. But if you're, now you know everything there is to know particle system wise and generating all of this, but I still want to show you a few things with creating rocks and some grass. So if you want to stick with me for a little bit longer, there's some cool things in this. So Shift A, we're going to create a UV sphere, move it out to the side. Control 2 to subdivide it a little bit. Go to the modifiers and let's find a displace modifier. New, go to the texture, you know the deal. Select clouds. A little bit extreme, right? We want to scale this up. I always hold down Shift when I'm dragging on values just because it makes it, I have more control. Maybe at the depth to give it more detail. Go back to the modifier. Do we want to? No, we don't want to decrease that. It's a good looking rock. Yeah, it's a good looking rock. So from here, obviously this is way too much, like way too much. If we started scattering this, it would be crazy. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a decimate modifier. If you select up here, you can enable your wireframe and shift drag on this just down, have control. And you can see that we're starting to decimate the rock because we don't really need that much detail in a rock like this. It's like a background prop you're not really supposed to notice. Yeah, that's pretty good. So a small tip. If you have an object with a lot of modifiers and you don't want to go in, drop down, apply, you can just select your object and hit F3 or space depending on how you've set up Blender and just hit convert, object convert mesh. That way it's now just a mesh with no modifiers on it. And it's just floating out in space. Deselect the wireframe. And because we've already made the ground shader, we don't want to make a rock shader from scratch. We'll just select our rock, shift select the ground, Control L, and hit link materials. Important to remember as you select this, I'm just going to name this ground so we can differentiate it. Make unique, otherwise you'll be editing the same material. And we'll call this rock 1. So I don't think I want green in this rock. We'll just make some tweaks. Maybe less detail, and we'll brighten it up just a tad. There we go, something like that. So now we have one rock, and we'll scatter that rock like we've done before. Select our plane, go to particles, drop down, dupe particle system. We'll call this rock 1. Actually, let's remember to make it unique. Call it rock 1, just to be sure. And rock 1, we're gonna delete that and select our rock. And now the rock is being scattered the same way the branches were, the same way the bush was, so we're not going to see it. So we'll just vary this a little bit, and we can see our rocks appear nicely there. One thing to keep in mind here that we do want is this to be just in the center of the axis, because that way it gets pushed into the ground. It doesn't float or anything. You can always pull it up if you want something different. So, I don't know, I think we're going to need a lot of rocks, and we're going to make them bigger. So, scale them. And let's just randomize these completely. And scale randomization might be good, actually. Maybe something like that. Okay, so that's a start. And then we'll take that same rock. We'll duplicate it, move it to the side. Let's be good here. Rock 1 geo. Rock 2 geo. Cool. So this will be our second rock. To make it easy for ourselves, I'm going to scale this down. Go to modifiers, hit decimate, and I'm going to decimate this. And we want this to be like almost like pebbles or something, so we really don't need a lot of details. Go to the shader, make unique, and this will be rock 2. And we'll decrease the detail level even more, and maybe make this even lighter. Cool. Select our plane again, go to particles, and select our rock 1, duplicate, make sure to select it, make it unique, call it rock 2, rock 2, and we'll play around with the seed. There we go. But this should probably be smaller, because it's like smaller pebbles, less details. And you can figure out, you know, if that's, maybe that's not quite enough. Let's do 700 smaller rocks like these, and now they're scattered all the way around. And you can play around with this to your heart's content. That's essentially it. So now, you know, now we're starting to get somewhere. You might want to just tweak the ground color slightly to be a little more yellowy. Now the last bit of creation here is going to be some grass. This is very basic grass, but it's quick to make, and I think it looks pretty great. So Shift A, create a plane. We'll just move it over here. Scale it in. That's about the width of kind of the grass that we want. Rotate it in Y, 90 degrees. So again, here you can do things differently. If I go into edit mode and move it up, you know, the origin point stays the same. I know I don't have to go in and do this afterwards. It just speeds things up a little bit when working, when you're doing this a lot. So, and then we'll create some variation in here. We'll merge this at the center, and we'll scale this in like so. We might want to just isolate this. It's always good to remember to be press Shift C to be in the X-ray mode. That way you'll be selecting all of your vertices. But yeah, we'll just give this like a slight bend to it. Nothing crazy. It's just you know, it's just some grass. There we go. Maybe that's too much actually. I won't do that. I think I'll just make it slightly thinner. There we go. And now we just go crazy essentially. The simplest way to make grass is just this. At least that's what I found. So I'll scale it down, I'll give it some variation, and I'll rotate it around. So this is probably not going to be the most exciting part to view, but I don't know. It creates some nice looking grass. So there, we've got like a base, right? So we can select all these, Shift D, hit R for rotate, hit Z, and just rotate these around a little bit. Select more, Shift D, move it over to the side maybe, give them a little bit of an angle. And then I'll start moving things out from the center as well, just so it's a broader area. You can literally, tweak this to your heart's content, which I won't, but still want it to look decent. I think one of the things that I think makes this work is, by duping it down under the ground like this, you're creating a look of different sort of lengths, besides from just scaling down, obviously. Then we'll just select a few random ones and we'll move it out here. Something like that. So now we have like a sort of a bush, right? So there we go. Okay, perfect. So we will select all these, hit Control J to merge them. And so what I like to do when I work like this is the pie menu I talked about in the beginning. Shift Control Alt and X and say origin to the center of mass. That way I just know everything will rotate around the center. But obviously we need to fix this. So we'll Control A and apply the scale, and we'll do the same thing with the rotation. We won't do the same with the location, obviously. But let's see here. So we'll hit Control period, and we'll just sort of get it on line with the y-axis there, and then get it down like there. So there we go. So things go below the ground. Now, what you can do to save on your geometry is cut some of this off. I want to keep some of it, but cut some of it off. We can do that with the knife tool really easily, actually. So hit K for the knife tool. In order to slice through things like this, you just hit C, for copy, and then you can slice through it all. There we go. So now it's sort of sliced all the way through. Hit 3 to select your faces and something like that. So now we've saved a little bit on geometry, and we've got something pretty decent. And for material, I'll just use what we have for the leaf. So Control L, link materials. I'll tweak this a little bit. Make unique. We'll call it grass. Shift right mouse button to create that connector. Throw in a hue and saturation in between there. And this, I want to make it more yellow. It's probably helpful to see what it actually looks like. So we'll drag this down here, maybe not that much. Pull the saturation down a little bit so it's more desaturated, something like that. So now we have pretty dry grass, right? So, and we can use what we've done before to just scatter the grass around. makes it really easy. Select our plane, go to particles, drop down, duplicate, select this, call this. Oh, I want to make it, before we do anything, make it unique, call it grass, and call this one grass. Probably don't want that many strands of grass. We'll do 200 for now, and we'll see what it looks like. There we go. And remember, if you don't see anything, it's because you're using the same seed value and it probably won't show up. Doesn't look like we can see any of them. So let's do 500. They're probably super tiny. They're right there underneath everything. And you see this suffer from the same problem as before, where the orientation, because it's upright, doesn't quite work. So we'll select it, hit N for our transforms, Y, rotate 90 degrees. That way they will be pointing upwards. Now I duplicated the smaller rocks, I think, so that might be why it's really small. Yeah, now we can start to see them pop up. There we go. Perfect. One thing you might want to do with this, seeing as that I duplicated it from the rocks, the randomize is throwing this off. So I'll just pull all the way down and just tweak it just so we get a little bit of variation, not too much. Again, if you pull the randomize all the way up, like axially, it'll just spin the grass all the way around and you'll end up with a weird look. This way, just a little bit of variation will just make them point mostly upwards. I might just scale these down just a little bit. So now we have some dead looking grass, and really all of our elements are in place. You know, we've created them all, and now we can start thinking about getting the scene to come together, and you know, the final lighting, camera setup, and any tweaks we want to do to our scene to get it to where we want it to. So first off, I'm going to go back to what I mentioned previously in the video, which is the HDRI. And with a simple node setup, we're going to split out the HDRI into its background and light part. So you can control the light and the background element independently. Hit Shift A, and we're going to find a node called light path. Light path has a bunch of basically if statements for different kinds of rays in the scene. The one we're worried about is camera ray. It basically looks at if a ray hits the camera or not, like is it true or false, and depending on that we can control whether we want our background to impact our light or if we want to separate it out. So after that, we are gonna find a background node, and we're gonna have two of these. One is for controlling the light, and the other one is going to be for controlling the background. So take our HDRI, plug it into both of these. Let's cut that connection. You can join these up if you want to make it a little more neat. And then we're going to find a mix shader and mix both of these background nodes into that and back into the surface. And right now, nothing has really changed because we're just feeding them in to the mix shader and mixing them 50-50. But now we can take the is camera ray into the fact value, and now we can independently control whether our background what our background and our light looks like. So if we just crank this up now, you can see that our light is pretty crazy. So I don't know, let's start by just doubling it. Maybe this is 1, this is 2. Actually, I think our light is good. Do the same thing with the background. The background is what we want to tweak a little bit, I think. Give it that deserty feel. So, and this is really powerful because if you cut that connection, now we just have a background color, and the background color doesn't do anything. It's just a visual thing. So you could make it bright pink, and anything you can throw in, I don't know, any sort of background here while retaining the light you get from the HDRI. Obviously, we don't want that. That's not what we want for this scene. And another really cool thing you can do to give yourself more control is select your node here at the end, hit Control T, and this gives you a mapping node. And if you just adjust the Z value, that'll let you sort of rotate the HDRI around. And because we're using the same HDRI for both of our elements, it will rotate the background and the light at the same time. But you could split this out as well and only have it rotate one. So like only rotate the light. Maybe there's one part of the HDRI or the background image that you really like, so you want to keep that. And while we have that in place, we're also going to look at our camera. So hit 0 to go into our camera, hit N to get our view up, and we're going to say render with our local camera and camera to view. The camera to view just lets us actually manipulate the camera. Otherwise, we'll be manipulating the perspective view instead of the camera. So this is sort of where we were before. And default cameras are created as a 50mm lens. So I'm going to go into the camera and set this to a 35mm lens. That's just to give me a little bit more depth, because it's a relatively small patch of vegetation that we have here. You could go even lower and do something like an 18mm. Your perspective might be weird, like the foreground elements might be stretched a little bit too much. So I'm gonna go 35. And these are just standard lenses really. Final thing I'll do with the camera for now is this passport 2. I'll bring it up to 1, you'll find it on the viewport display, and that just hides everything outside of the camera view. I think it's a little easier to arrive at your final composition when you block out everything else. It's a little bit distracting with things around here. But I'm going to go from sort of diagonal to diagonal just to give me the most amount of depth, and something like that. And then I want to just rotate this around a little more. I like the mountain range here in the background, so I want to see more of that. I think there, maybe, because then I like the way the light sort of falls here as well. So next up, one of the things I just want to adjust is, even though we created displacement maps and made some variation in this, I still think it looks a little bit flat. I'm going to go into our particles and just turn these off. That way I can adjust it more easily. Go in, rotate it on the y-axis. I'm just going to rotate it down so yeah, that looks pretty good. So now we have a little bit more variation in the terrain. And finally, for the terrain, I think I'm also gonna up the subdivision here just to give us a little bit more detail. And I might, I don't know, bring this down a little bit now so it's not too crazy. Let's do 45. There we go. So now it casts some shadow, but it's not too intense. And looking at it here, we can see that the background plate is more yellowy. It's more saturated, whereas this is more gray. I guess it's more orangey, and this is a little more yellowy. So let's go back into our object. And for the shader for the ground, I'm just going to adjust these colors just a tad. I want to bring in some more saturation. Maybe like that. Do the same thing here. Maybe make it a little bit brighter. And then do the same thing over here, really. There we go. Could adjust this as well. I think there. Cool. Okay, so now we have something color-wise that matches the ground. Not the top part here where there's more vegetation, but down here on the ground, I think that matches it a little bit more closely. Moving on, we're going to go back into our particle system, and we're going to check up on these sort of one by one. It can be a little bit tricky to get a proper overview when everything is just turned on. There's just so much detail here, and we haven't really made a decision when it comes to our camera placement and what this looks like in camera. We've just sort of been going on off of this and saying, okay, that looks pretty good. But there are adjustments that I want to make to this, and this is a good time to do it now. So what I usually do is I turn off everything but one element, and that gives me a chance to look at it in isolation and then slowly build that detail level back up. And one thing that I'm seeing here is that while we are in the desert, I want this to feel like a small oasis. So I want more saturation and more light in on these leaves. So I'm going to select the leaves again. And first thing I might want to do is just crank these shadows here just to give us a little bit more variation in the leaves and the translucency. And then I think I'm going to adjust these colors as well just to be more, just a little bit more lush. Do the same thing down here. And a simple change is going to be the translucent value here. Oh, okay, that actually worked. I think, yeah, and then now we're letting in more light. If we look at, let's see, set to 1.8. I feel like it's a little bit dull. I was going to go 2, but 2 is where it caps out. So 2.5 just to crank it up a little bit more. It does take away from the realism just a little bit, but I think we can make this work. One final thing I think I'm going to do here is take our hue and saturation, shift right drag just to unify these inputs. And I'm going to put one right before everything. Whoa, okay, bit extreme. Lower the value to 1 so it doesn't really impact anything. Actually, I'll leave that hue. I think, yeah, the hue's good. But I might want to just bring down the saturation just a tiny bit. There we go. So now it's letting in more light. It's a little bit more lush than it was before. And I think overall, yeah, that looks better. I might just do like a little tweak here. There we go. Okay. Enough bushes for now. Okay, that's pretty cool. So looking at this, I would say, you know, we're in the desert. I think there are too many bushes now. So let's adjust this. Go down to half, see what we can get at. We could always play around with like the seed or something to get something different, maybe. And one thing that you'll notice now is that, it might be hard to see on the render, but you can see that little stick that comes out of the ground. You do notice it in some places, but we can fix that. What I'm actually just going to do is I'm just going to scale these down. Yeah, just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to take the bush, and if we go into edit mode, select everything. Now that the origin point stays the same because we're in edit mode, we can sort of move this down. Just turn off proportional editing. And if we move it down, you can see we affect all of the bushes, right? So I'm just going to move it into the ground, something like this. So I feel like we get a little bit more coverage that way, and it looks a little bit better, I think. And then we can start building this up one item at a time. We have our branches. I think our branches are fine, actually. Then we have our rocks. And one thing that I'm noticing with the rocks here is that I want a lot more of them because the ground plane doesn't really have that much detail and it's not that exciting. And another thing I'm noticing is that they aren't shaded smoothly. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double this to 1,000, maybe scale them down just a little bit, maybe double them again to 2,000 rocks, something like that. Really, you know, full coverage on the ground here because I think that's gonna work a little bit better. Maybe 1,500. There we go. I think I'm gonna give the other rocks the same treatment. What I'm noticing, I forgot to switch out the rocks. There we go. So if you forgot to do that too, there we go. Now we're on the same page. And we have 700 of these. Let's do, because these are smaller, right? So the smaller rocks, we might want, I don't know, more of these. maybe 6K or something like that. That's probably good. Okay, something like that. So now we have more variation on the ground as well, which I think looks a lot more interesting. Let's find it good. There we go. And we can't forget about our last element, which is going to be our grass. And so because we updated the leaf, I'm going to just Control L and link these two materials together. Again, remember to go in and make this unique. I have grass material. I actually just update the name of this as well, just so they share the same saturation level here. I'll lower this back down to 1.8 like it was before, but I might want to shift the hue slightly. Not too much. A little more saturation. Something like that. You know, now there's a nice interplay between the slightly yellow grass and the bushes. And then we can go in on our bushes, sorry, our grass, and we can adjust the grass as well. I think there's too much, like maybe half of that, maybe 200, something like that. And then actually I want to go 180. There we go. So now there's a little bit of dry grass, but not too much. And we still want the focus to be mostly on the bush and the rocks, I guess. The rocks, I think, complement this really nicely now. And then we can work on just finalizing the last little bits here. What I'm going to do is hit Shift A and add a UV sphere into the scene. Scale up a little bit. I want a focus element for our camera and something that we as the viewer can look at that's not necessarily all bushes. There we go. So I'm kind of, maybe there's like an alien artifact or something out in the desert. Let's imagine that. Shade smooth. And so for that, just gonna, I don't know, make it a little bit sci-fi, I guess. There we go. So now we have something to look at that's a little more interesting than just a plain old sphere, right? Cool, so now we're getting somewhere. We've got some nice intensity on our leaves. The ground is nice and varied with the rocks and the branches. But one thing that still stands out to me a little bit is just the harshness of the light. Now, I know that we're in the desert, so there's not going to be a lot of respite from the sun, but you can use existing elements. So let's just rotate this back. See, backspace over any number value to reset everything. Scale this up a little bit. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, you know. When you already have nice assets that you've created, might as well use them. So I'm just going to position a few of these around as like small shadow elements to catch a little bit of shadow and to guide our eye to look at this instead. Let's see. Always tricky. I mean, you can literally just do this for days, and you want to obviously be good with your time. You don't want to spend too long. But I just wanted to show you the possibilities of doing something like this. Maybe something like that. So now it just separates out our elements a little bit more. So I feel like we can focus more on this. We've got this like small path that leads up to the main focus of our scene, right? And the last little thing with the camera you can do to push this even further, we go into our camera settings and enable depth of field. Lower your f-stop value, just to really show you how crazy you can get. That's crazy right now, there's no focus element, but that's where the sphere comes in. So just select our sphere. There we go. Everything in the background and far away in the foreground and background is going to be blurred. But I think it's too much. Might do half an f-stop. And that concludes our tutorial. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. And if obviously if you're watching this, you made it all the way. That's impressive because this is a long tutorial. But I hope you learned something along the way. Lots of different and interesting techniques in a tutorial like this, and you can apply that to a lot of different things within Blender, right? The particle systems are a really powerful system. And once you know how to manipulate it properly, it's not just foliage. You can do really everything with it. And yeah, so if you've made anything interesting or make anything interesting following this tutorial, make sure to leave us a link down below in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.